I want to just introduce, Chris Coenraets. We are really happy to have him here, and he works at Adobe in the PhoneGap team, and he has recently presented at in London, right? So yep. I will let Chris take from here. Yeah, thanks, Chris, for being here.
All right. Thanks everybody for coming tonight. Thank you, Sanjay, for letting me speak tonight, and Matrix for hosting. So tonight we're going to speak about PhoneGap, and I'll try to introduce you to the process of building cross-platform mobile applications with PhoneGap. So very quickly, a little bit about myself. As Sanjay mentioned, I work with the PhoneGap team at Adobe. I blog a lot about PhoneGap stuff. So if you want to learn, I have a number of tutorials. If you want to learn about PhoneGap, not only PhoneGap, but I blog a lot about HTML, JavaScript, Backbone, Node.js, that kind of stuff. So if you want to take a look at my website, and of course, you need to grow my fan base on Twitter, so you need to follow me. It's important. All right. So before we start, I want to know a little bit about yourself. When I do this, I often have many different audiences. So how many people here have played with PhoneGap at all? Wow, great. Mostly that side, right? I don't know how that Okay, so I'll tell you guys how to do it. How many people would consider themselves developers as opposed to designers? Developers, oh, okay. And how many designers, just to have an idea? Just a few. Okay, we'll try to make it work for both of you. So that's a little bit about yourself. I also do trip reports when I'm based in Boston, as you can hear. They all have that, they all speak like that in Boston. We do trip reports. So when I do a trip report, what I need to do is, bring back that feedback, these questions, answers to the questions that I just asked you, but also they like to see a picture of the audience. So what I do, I click here, and that triggers the camera. Of course, I don't have such a wide angle, but I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to do that. And here we go. And now I have the picture, and I can do, maybe a little tilt here. All right, so they will be happy to see that. Now, based on this, the question that I have for you is, what is the presentation technology that I'm using to do this presentation here? Am I using PowerPoint? Am I using Keynote? What am I using? Come on, you need to help me. I had a long day.
PhoneGap?
PhoneGap, absolutely. Now, I'm not going to position PhoneGap as a keynote killer tonight. That's not at all what PhoneGap is about. But I figured, and this is really a new thing that I've started doing, is, we're going to speak about HTML, building HTML applications, and you can build slides using HTML. There are a lot of solutions out there like Reveal.js and stuff like that. Maybe some of you have seen those. So I could use that, and it works in the browser. But what I really want to do is show you the capabilities of PhoneGap as I'm doing the presentation, as opposed to going in my slides here and then say, hey, and now I'm going to switch here to show you how to do it in PhoneGap. So that's why I'm doing it this way, and we will see if that works, and at the same time, I have a nice picture of you guys. All right, so with that out of the way, we can start talking about PhoneGap. So what I'm going to do tonight, I'm going to show you a bunch of slides, or this is essentially a PhoneGap application, so it's HTML, but let's call them slides, just to introduce you to the concept. But at the end of the day, slides are quite boring, so we'll leave the slides pretty soon, and I will show you how to do it. And I will also show you some apps that other people like you have built with PhoneGap. Now, since some of you haven't seen PhoneGap at all and maybe you're not familiar with PhoneGap, this is the problem that we're trying to solve. Okay? And that is what I call the N platforms, N apps problem. If you want to target N platforms, you need to build N apps, right? And that's at some point it becomes unviable. You can't really build 6 or 7 versions of a single application that you want to build. Question?
Just for the what is who is the target?
That's a really good question. And I've been doing this, PhoneGap for 2.5 years. And finally, in December 2012, I met my first beta developer. It was in Montreal on a very cold night, and it was the first time that I met a beta developer. Beta is actually an operating system built by Samsung, and that's right.
So what about the upside down exploration?
So this guy, that's Symbian, still very popular in Europe. That's the operating system of the Nokia phone. Well, before they embraced Windows Phone, that was their platform, but so still very popular in Europe. But you make a good point. So, you're never going to build 6 or 7 versions of your app. So you're going to say, Bada, no way. Symbian, no way. WebOS, it's kind of dying. And now nobody is going to cry if you don't target these 4 guys. And now you're going to say, can I build 4 apps? Now that's still too much. And what I see a lot is people essentially killing everything except iOS. Right? That's the first approach they take to mobile development to keep it manageable. But then, in terms of market share, Android is way bigger, in fact, than iOS. Windows Phone, I saw a Surface out there. I mean, there are really some real contenders out there. And the matter is not settled. I don't know if some of you have read about Firefox OS. So that's the new mobile platform from Mozilla. Okay, and they are starting they don't target the US market initially because they want to go cheap and target emerging markets. But who knows, if that's successful, who knows what's going to happen. For the alpha geeks, probably mostly in the developer community, Ubuntu is also coming up with a platform. So that thing is not settled, it's going to continue to move, and who knows what's going to happen. But, I was visiting a big customer here in Dallas, can't tell you who, but it's big. There is no way they can get away with targeting a single platform. Their customer base wants at least 3 different platforms, if not 4. So that's the problem that we're trying to solve. It's not manageable. So what we're looking for is kind of an abstraction layer to say, no, I can't do that. I want to write the application once and make it run on all these different platforms. So I need that kind of abstraction layer. Now, anybody in the room knows an abstraction layer that allows you to run on all these guys, but writing the application only once? No, you're going too fast, but I'll come back to you in a second. HTML, right? With HTML, you can build an application that's going to run on all these guys just fine. At least that's the theory. You may have to tweak for different browsers, but in general, that's how it works. But how are you going to deploy that web app? Through the browser, right? Now you're going to have to, it's fine, single application, but you need to deploy it through the browser. Try to send index.html to the App Store and say, can you please host my app? You're not going to take that. Obviously, the only thing they take is an IPA, so some binary format, a native application. So there is a problem there. We have a nice abstraction layer, but you can't really build apps that you deploy through the different app stores. And that was the initial idea behind PhoneGap, is to use that technology, but essentially wrap it inside a native shell. So that orange frame that you see there is a teeny tiny native shell. So it's a native application on each platform. And the only thing it does is what? Wrap that web app into that native container. So it's a very small native container. And the only thing it does, it basically has one component. And that component is called a web view. And what is a web view? It's essentially an HTML rendering component that's available on all the SDKs of these different platforms. So yeah, it's like a, I don't know, a text area, but instead of displaying text, it displays HTML. And typically, it leverages the underlying browser that's available on that platform. So on iOS and Android, it's leveraging WebKit. Okay? Question?
Do you want to do questions now or at the end?
Sure. Go ahead.
So
Yeah.
how does WebGL fit into this?
WebGL, we'll talk about that in a second, but it's a good question in general, because people are, when I start talking, people are going to say, is PhoneGap supporting this? Is PhoneGap supporting Canvas? Is PhoneGap supporting WebGL? And the answer is always the same. If the underlying browser supports it, PhoneGap supports it. The point is, PhoneGap is not a browser. PhoneGap doesn't ship with an HTML rendering component. PhoneGap leverages what's available on your platform. So again, on iOS and Android, it's WebKit. If it's supported in that mobile WebKit, it's going to work. If not, it's not going to work. So, we are not going to be super consistent, not more than the mobile browser that's available on all these platforms.
No, you answered my question indirectly.
Okay.
So you mentioned Android and iOS, right? For the Windows, the underlying browser with IE.
Yeah.
And I've heard that it's not fully compatible with HTML5, so I've faced any issues.
Of course. In the same way, you face issues if you were to build an application that you deploy in the browser. You're going to have some incompatibilities. IE doesn't support exactly all the features, and there are some differences. So yes, but these are the same issues you would face if you build for the browser. So in other words, it is very manageable.
I've heard that iOS has a limitation on the web views rendering capabilities compared to mobile Safari. Is that true?
That's true. There are a couple of differences between the web view and mobile Safari, the browser.
But it's mostly speed. As far as feature support, it's the same, right?
Feature support is the same. So in mobile Safari, they enable Nitro, which is the kind of the fast JavaScript engine. It's not enabled yet in the web view. So there are some.
Do you know if they have plans to, or is that still up in the air?
We hope.
Yeah.
They plan it, but that's really for Apple to answer.
WebGL, is PhoneGap abstract WebGL?
Yes, so we're going to get into that very, very soon, actually. Okay, so is that very clear? So the first thing, and I'm going to keep asking you questions, but the first thing that you need to remember is that PhoneGap is a wrapper. It simply takes a web application. You can build it the way you want. Some people like to use, jQuery, jQuery Mobile, SendShop, Backbone, Angular, all these frameworks. People ask us, can I build my application like that? From the PhoneGap point of view, as long as it's a web app, as long as it's a bunch of HTML, JavaScript, and CSS files, we'll gladly wrap it. Okay? And once we wrap it, you can give that to the App Store, because that orange thing is a native app. So that's something that you can push to the App Store. Now, because that's a native app, it means that on iOS, it's an Objective-C application. On Android, it's a Java application. Then you have different flavors of C, C++. The bottom line is you don't want to write these wrappers. And that's part of the value that PhoneGap provides. We give you all these native applications, all these native containers, if you want, for each platform. But you're not happy with just a wrapper. Because how would you access your camera, for instance? How would you access the accelerometer? How would you access your contacts on your device? If you want to build a modern, cool mobile application, of course you want access to the camera and to all these nice, features that come with your device. Okay? So the second thing that PhoneGap is, it is a bridge. Okay? It's a bridge that's going to give you access to all these native features that are available on your device. So camera, let's see, accelerometer, compass, contacts, microphone, file system, events, database, all that you can have access to. If you want to know from within your PhoneGap application if your battery is running low, you can listen to an event for that. And of course, these are things that are not available natively in a web app, right? There is nothing in JavaScript that lets you listen to a low battery event. Okay, so these are all bridging capabilities that we provide as part of PhoneGap. Now the nice thing here is that it's a consistent JavaScript API. So in other words, as a developer of a PhoneGap application, you don't have to wonder, hey, am I running on iOS? Am I running on Android? And if I'm running on iOS, then I'm invoking that API. If I'm running on Android, I'm invoking that API. No, it's a. Okay, see, that's the problem of doing that. Okay, I shouldn't move that. It's a consistent JavaScript API, always the same, and we will do the magic behind the scenes to actually invoke the right native API for the device the application is running on. Does that make sense? So, number one was PhoneGap is a wrapper. Number two, PhoneGap is a bridge. And that's essentially what PhoneGap is. It is nothing else than that. So a lot of times people ask us, well, should I use PhoneGap or jQuery mobile? That question, I know it's not you who asked it, but it doesn't make sense because PhoneGap is not a UI framework. PhoneGap is not an MVC framework. PhoneGap is a wrapper and a bridge, and we don't care at all about the way you build your web application. Okay, so let me give you some examples of some of the APIs. Question first.
So, quick question. So, you listed the device APIs up there. If there's some that exist on one device that don't on another, what does PhoneGap do?
What do we do if a feature exists on one platform but not on the other platform? So if one platform implements it and 6 don't, then we will probably not implement it. If it's more like 3 and 3, we will probably implement it. Okay, and on 3 platforms, it's not gonna work, essentially. Now the key thing to know is that if for some reason we didn't provide an abstraction to it, that doesn't mean that you can't use that feature. And I'll come to that in a second, but basically the short answer is plugins. We have a plugin architecture that lets you connect to whatever you want, some exotic feature provided by one platform, or some native code that you wrote that obviously is not available on all the other platforms. Yes?
What's the catch? Is it free to use, and why isn't everybody? Why wouldn't I use this?
There is absolutely no reason for you to. Does that answer the question? And there is no catch. It's completely free, not only free, but open source, and we'll talk about that in a second. Yes?
For instance, in iOS, does the eventing model extend out to like in-app purchases? Because I heard that there's really a lot of specifics about you have to use native Objective-C.
Yeah, and when that is the case, plugin is the answer, right? So if it's something really specific, like push notification, in-app purchase, local notification, even though local notification we actually abstract, but all these very, very specific plugins, and I'll speak about plugins in a second, so I don't want to.
If there are patches or hotfixes for some of the operating systems like iOS or RIM or Android, how do you guys handle it? I mean, if there is
if they have a hotfix, so as you will see in a second, a lot of these platforms, they work directly with us.
Okay.
Okay, with a couple of exceptions, or mainly one exception. I'll let you guess. But even if they don't proactively work with us, you know, we are members of their developer program, so which means that we get the beta version of every single you know, version of the OS that they release and things like that. So usually we have plenty of time to get ready when they release something new. Question?
What kind of overhead does PhoneGap introduce since it's sort of away from the bare metal? Is there the sluggishness, the performance?
Right, so can you guys hear the questions when it's, yeah, okay. So is there overhead that's introduced by PhoneGap? So what's really important to understand is that PhoneGap is not a runtime, or PhoneGap is not a virtual machine if you want. Okay, and typically these are the solutions who introduce some latency. This is really running HTML kind of natively as provided by the platform. So we'll get into the whole performance, you know, question later, but from a pure architectural point of view, there is no reason, there is no additional latency introduced because there is no indirection, if you want. There is no runtime, there is no you know, virtual machine.
Is it possible with PhoneGap to update your app without going through the app process? Because part of the App Store guidelines,
yes,
you can't introduce new code later on.
Yeah.
Is that possible?
Excellent question. So is it possible with PhoneGap to update your application without publishing an update of your application on the App Store, which can be very frustrating for the users if every single day, you know, you find a bug, oh my God, I need to fix that, and all of a sudden the user says, oh, you need to install that update. You know, once every 3 months it's fine, but if you do that every day, people get frustrated. And the answer is absolutely, you can totally do that. And that's the beauty of a PhoneGap application being HTML. So we don't really have a built-in way of doing it because it's so easy to do, and you probably want to do it your own way. But I'll give you the big picture. The way I've done it, the way I've seen other people do it, you keep a kind of a manifest, can be a JSON file, for instance, XML file at the client side with a version of each HTML page that your application uses. So this is 1.0. When you load the application, you do a delta with a manifest on the server that has, you know, the latest version of everything. And you find the differences. And then you can say, oh, there is a difference there. There is a new version of that, you know, contact.html. Let me download that behind the scenes. Okay, and now you have full access to the file system. So you copy that that file on your file system, and you're good to go. Now, so the answer from a technical point of view, no problem at all. And a lot of people do it. Like you know, a very popular hybrid application is LinkedIn. So they use the container approach, the wrapper approach. And they do that all the time. If you pay attention to LinkedIn, you'll see that all of a sudden the UI looks different, even though you didn't update the app. So they do it. Now, Apple has some guidelines that, you know, I mean, it's not a clear line, but certainly you couldn't make your application be an empty shell and then essentially load everything from the server. That wouldn't comply with the Apple guidelines. Okay? Now, where exactly is the line? Well, there is no clarity there. But, you know, if you once in a while update pages in the background, but that everything lives mostly locally, you should be good. All right. So I wanted to show you some of these APIs. So for instance, geolocation, so we'll see if that works. That seems to show me Sydney, Australia, which is not where we are. So I'm gonna ask for the current locations. Notice that you get access to all the permissions. PhoneGap can't magically do something if you didn't agree to it. Just like you would have in a native app, you're gonna have to say, yeah, okay, I'm fine with this application accessing my current location. So I'm gonna say yes, and hopefully, does that look better? Is that more or less where we are? All right, so that's simple geolocation. So let's look at the other one, and that will give a chance to everybody to be in my picture. In addition to taking a picture, which I started with, in my presentation, imagine that for some reason you needed to take a video from within your HTML application. So let's do that. I'm gonna trigger that here, and we're gonna start there. Don't worry, I'm not gonna publish that on YouTube. Okay, you're all in, so I'm gonna stop here and say, now I'm gonna use it. And here we go. So now the video has been captured, and not only can I capture it, but I can of course play it back, all that from within the HTML application running inside PhoneGap. So these are some of the APIs. I'm showing you 2 here, but the list is very long. File system access, microphone access, database access, all that you have access to. Question?
You mentioned plugins. Are those also free and open source?
They are coming right. Almost. The next slide. They are coming. So I'll answer that question in 1 second. So one thing that I mentioned, and that connects to your question already, is that PhoneGap is free and open source. So I need to give you a little bit of the history of PhoneGap here. PhoneGap was initially developed by a company in Canada called Nitobi in Vancouver. And a year and a half ago, a little more maybe, Adobe acquired that company. Now that company had already made plans to contribute PhoneGap to Apache, to make it clear that they intended PhoneGap to be and stay open source. Okay? So when Adobe acquired Nitobi, Adobe said, sure, we are still gonna do that. It's going to Apache. And it went to Apache, but for branding reasons, it went under Apache under a different name, and the name under Apache is Cordova. So if you hear about Apache Cordova, that is essentially PhoneGap. PhoneGap, Adobe kept the rights to the brand, but PhoneGap is essentially a distribution of Apache Cordova. It's essentially the exact same thing. In fact, if you go to phonegap.com and you click download, you get Cordova 2.5.0.zip. There is no difference at all. Okay? Open source, free, free. Okay?
I'm curious, why was it called PhoneGap and not MobileGap?
And that's what?
Not MobileGap. Like, a lot of my colleagues wouldn't come tonight because they're like, I don't develop for phones. I'm more interested in iPads and notes and things
right.
like that.
Well,
so
what was your proposal for that?
Why is it not MobileGap?
Oh, MobileGap, yeah. Well, when PhoneGap was started, tablets were not what they are today. And in fact, nobody seemed to care about tablets. I think PhoneGap was probably started, and I can tell you that, in fact, that it was started before the iPad was even released. And so, now we live with that legacy, but the name had, it has name recognition. People know that name. We talked internally about changing the name, but it has so much name recognition and goodwill associated to it that I think that's what it's going to be.
I can tell you attendance tonight, at least for my company, was hindered by PhoneGap.
Yeah.
Because people are like, I don't really care about phones. I want to develop for PCs and notepads and tablets and things like that. So
good feedback. So you can go back to them tomorrow and tell them
I
you
will,
should check out Cordova.
Yes.
But it's a good point. I mean, I totally see your point. And if it became, if we start hearing that feedback consistently, we may have to do something about it. All right, so is that clear? Okay, now the reason this is important, I told you about the bridging APIs, being able to access the accelerometer, the camera, and things like that. Now, who do you think knows really well how to access the camera APIs on Android? Google engineers, right? These guys, I mean, they wrote the thing. They wrote the native APIs. They really know how to write to that API. Who knows how to do it on, a Windows phone? Microsoft does. On a Nokia phone, Nokia does. Well, the beauty about Cordova being an Apache project is that all these vendors feel very comfortable contributing to it. And in fact, if you look at the list of Cordova contributors, you will see people from Google, from Microsoft, from Nokia, from BlackBerry, and from Intel and others. Okay? And that's great because these are the guys. What do these guys do? They write these bridging APIs essentially. Now, I need to be very, very clear here, and that's the nature of open source, so I'm sure all of you are familiar with that, but my big disclaimer, and the key word here is individual, because when you contribute to Apache, you never contribute as your employer. You always contribute as an individual. Okay? Of course, most of the contributors to Cordova are still Adobe employees, but when they contribute to Apache, they contribute as themselves. Okay, so don't go out there and say that, that Cordova is a joint Adobe, Google, Microsoft project. Yes, we have engineers from all these companies. Okay, but that is great news because these bridging APIs are top-notch because they are built by the guys who build the native APIs, and that's really great news. Plugins. Here we are. And the question was, are they free and open source? So let me reiterate. First, plugins is when you are looking for something that we didn't abstract. So we abstract a lot of things, but let's say barcode scanner. If you look at the list of APIs that we abstract, because if you want, barcode scanner is a kind of a higher level API, most of the time on top of the camera API. Okay, so you kind of stream, and then you try to understand what that barcode means. We didn't abstract that yet natively in the platform, but there is a plugin for that. Okay? And there are a lot of things. I spoke about push notifications, local notifications, and things like that. Facebook integration, the single sign-on using your Facebook account and that kind of stuff. All that is available through plugins. Now the question was, are they free and open source? We don't build them. Adobe doesn't, well, even though we build a few actually, but it's essentially a community effort. Okay? It's actually hosted on GitHub, and I will show you that in a second. When I'm done with my slides, we're going to move to my browser. I'll show you a bunch of things. But it's a GitHub repository where you find all the plugins. So if someone tells you, well, I can't use PhoneGap because it doesn't provide access to this exotic feature, your answer is not true. There is always a backdoor. Whatever you can do natively, you can always do through a plugin because a plugin is native. Okay, so that's your backdoor to access any weird, strange feature that your application may need access to. Okay, and I'll show you a few examples a little later in my presentation. Some people are going to say, well, you can't use HTML to get really the user experience that people expect from a mobile application because it's all about touch, and in HTML you can't really support touch that well. Is that true? Not at all. I mean, it's, you know, it's not always, the APIs are not always extremely consistent and clear and easy to use, but you can do absolutely everything. And in fact, you can even do, you know, combine different things at the same time. There is nothing in terms of touch. It can be taps, it can be drags, and it can be combined gestures. You can do all that like I do it here. Remember, this is a PhoneGap application that I'm using here. So you can absolutely do that, and it's actually fairly easy to do. All right, now people are also, and maybe you wonder, you know, what's the difference between a PhoneGap application and a native application? Because that's really what it's all about, right? When should you use PhoneGap and when should you use native? Let me first tell you that, you know, the message of the PhoneGap team is not, you know, native is useless, you should always use PhoneGap. That is not at all the message that we want to communicate. In fact, we are in a bad place to deliver that message because some of the applications that we build as Adobe don't use PhoneGap. And the flagship Adobe application, Photoshop, we have a tablet and a phone version. You should try it, it's really cool. It's not using PhoneGap. And for a good reason. This is not a good use case for PhoneGap at all. Right? It's very, very, very resource intensive. You should see that code. You know, it's all about processing, going through pixel, I mean literally pixel by pixel, applying filters, transformation, and things like that. All you do, most of what you do, is very intensive computations. Maybe not a good use case for a PhoneGap application. If you wanted to build the latest, completely wild 3D game, well, you know, maybe PhoneGap is not the right technology to do that. But I would say that for 80% of the bread and butter applications that you're building, you're never, if you build the application right, and we'll spend the rest of the night talking about, talking about how to do it right, people will not see the difference between a native application and your app. So what's the difference? Well, first one is important, it's skills. You know, if you want to go the native route and you want to do it yourself, you're going to have to build one version in Objective-C, one version in Java, one version in C++, or, you know, different versions of C++. Because it's not cross-platform and this is cross-platform. Do you have access to all the devices APIs? Yes. How is it distributed? Through the App Store for both, so no problem there. For the updates, and that was your question, PhoneGap actually has an advantage, is that you can deliver updates of your application without needing to reinstall the app or to install an official update through the App Store. So that, for some people, especially large apps, that is a huge advantage. Okay. Performance, PhoneGap is fast. If you do it right, and again, we'll speak about that later in my presentation here, if you do it right, PhoneGap is really fast. But guess what? Native is always faster. Is that going to be the bottleneck of your application? As I said before, for 80–85% of the applications that you may build, that's not going to be the bottleneck, and you're not going to see the difference. But I'm not going to argue, because it would be silly on my part to argue that, you know, PhoneGap is faster or as fast as a native app. No, because it's HTML and JavaScript. In the same way, a web app running in the browser is not as fast as a native app on your desktop, right? Is it fast enough? Most of the time, yes. Can the user see a difference? Most of the time, no. Okay? but that doesn't mean that there are no use cases for native apps. So, in other words, the differences between native and hybrid are getting blurry. Thank you. And how did I do that, by the way? How did I do that blurry thing? CSS, exactly. And that's just, I wanted to make the point that, you know, in HTML these days, with all the innovation that's coming in HTML, and it's not coming, it's there. See, I can do this, and I can do that, and this is all in a PhoneGap app. It's already available in WebKit. You can apply blur filters and other filters. You can do all that. So there is a lot you can do to make your application very, very expressive. Okay, so blurry lines between native and hybrid.
Yes, I'm just curious. Let's say I didn't want to target desktops and all, and just mobile platforms. Do I need to concern myself with Modernizer and all the other like feature simulations, or can I just write everything in HTML5 and CSS3, and PhoneGap takes care of the graceful degradation or progressive enhancement?
Yep, good question. So the question is, if I go the PhoneGap route and I don't really care about supporting desktop and specifically old browsers like IE6 and the like, do I need to use libraries like Modernizer to kind of do feature detection and, you know, making sure that the thing is going to work, or does PhoneGap support that? So let me tell you how PhoneGap works. So for each feature, like camera and things like that, it's exposed by a PhoneGap object. If the feature is not available, so, you know, let's say camera, you can test if camera equals null, or if camera, then you do this, otherwise you don't do anything. So that's how you can very easily detect if a specific feature is available in PhoneGap. Once your application is initialized, you test these objects. If they are null, it means that PhoneGap was unable to initialize the object, which means that that feature was not supported.
Right.
So the need for Modernizer is not as, you know, because there is some overlap in this case.
Right.
Because you can do it by testing the PhoneGap object.
I guess it was more a multi-point question, like the CSS, for instance. Let's say you had a mobile platform that didn't support RGBA, right? And
yes.
And in desktops, you always preclude that by saying
yes.
an RGB value or color value, so that if it's not supported, you
yes.
at least get something.
In that case, for these features that are not PhoneGap specific, but that are, you know, kind of generic features of HTML, CSS, if you want to test if that specific feature is available, Modernizer in that case is a very good way of doing it.
This question is about the performance. So is it the web UI in between, which is kind of, that's the reason the performance is, I mean, a little less than the native app? I'm curious why it is not as close to as native.
For the same reason, a web app on the desktop is not as fast as an app that you would write in C++ for the desktop. For exactly the same reason. Because it's JavaScript that has to be interpreted you know, by the JavaScript interpreter or just-in-time compiler. Now, it is much, 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 much better than it used to be, because now, you know, you have you know, JIT compilers and things like that. But it's that simple reason. Okay. All right. So the lines are getting blurry. Okay, and that's all you need to know about PhoneGap, except for the demonstrations that I will do in a second. So PhoneGap is what? Two things, a router and a bridge. I'm hammering that in your head because, you know, this is really what it is, and I want to make sure that you understand that it's the scope of PhoneGap is by design limited to these different things. So it's a native app so you can deploy it to all the different app stores, and it's a web app which gives you the portability. Now, because it is a native app, as a developer, you still have a problem. And you know what that problem is? The problem is this, that it has that shell, okay? And that shell is different for each platform because it's native on each platform. So this is a piece of Objective-C, this is a piece of Java. I can't go too far to that side. This is a piece of C++. So it is native code. And once you provide the content of your application, what you need to do, you need to build it, right? You need to compile it and create an IPA, an APK, and all the other packaging units that you need to submit to the app stores. Now, how do you compile an iOS application, a native iOS application? How do you do that? Any native iOS developers? You use Xcode, right? And it has the iOS SDK, and boom, you can build it. How do you compile an Android application? The Android SDK, typically that you can run by itself, is the command line, or that you also can install on top of Eclipse, and now in Eclipse you compile it. How do you compile a native Windows application? It's getting harder. And to make it even a little harder, how do I do that on my Mac? Whatever the answer is, okay? It's going to be really hard to do here, okay? And the other way around, how do you compile an iOS application on your Windows machine? You can't, all right? And even if you could, you see the problem. Now I already have two SDKs, two IDs. The answer here is Visual Studio with the Windows Phone SDK. Okay, 3 IDs, 3 SDKs, 4 IDs, 4 SDKs. You're not going to do that, right? I mean, I can install 2, and I'm comfortable in Xcode. I'm very comfortable in Eclipse. That's great. Visual Studio, as you can tell, is going to be a little challenge for me and all the other guys. How do you compile a data application? I have. So even though PhoneGap solves the cross-platform problem, it doesn't solve the cross-platform build problem. You still need to build for each platform, and that's a huge problem. So what we decided to do was to come up with a service to do that. And that service we call PhoneGap Build. And what you do when you use PhoneGap Build, you focus exclusively on building a web app. Okay, you work on your HTML, JavaScript, and CSS files. That's all you do. You don't install any SDK, any mobile SDK. You don't install any IDE if you don't want to. You can do it in TextMate, Notepad, whatever you want to do. When you're ready, you upload your application to PhoneGap Build, and in the cloud, PhoneGap Build is going to build for 6 or 7 different platforms. Boom, automatically you get an IP, an APK, and all the different packaging units ready to be deployed to the different app stores.
You've never seen them on their native devices at that point. It's faith-based computing.
Well, I like that. Imagine in his situation, he maybe, that's the perfect combo. Look, he has a Windows machine and an iPhone. Okay, so he can't compile the application, but at least he can test it because he has the device. So with PhoneGap Build, and I will demonstrate that later, he can build it in the cloud and then test it on its device. If something is wrong, he's going to make the change, ask for a new compilation, build in the cloud, and test it again. So,
what I understand, I would have to use a Mac initially to set up my keys or whatever. And then after that, the build can...
Right, you still need to create keys. I'm not 100% positive that you can do that from a Windows machine. If you go on the iOS portal, it's only in a browser, so I'm not sure.
Once you're building, the build will handle what the Mac normally would have done.
Right, and I will show that in a second. So, yeah.
So the PhoneGap Build cloud service, does it have to be done in the public cloud, or can we somehow install it in a private network?
You can install it in a private network, but you will have then to provide the keys so that we can get to your. So if your question is, can we have a private cloud on-premise? No. But what we can do is get to your repository, like not the public GitHub, but your private GitHub, for instance. But we need to have your keys. We need to exchange keys to be able to access your repository.
So if you have built some of your own plugins, then I'm guessing this build service won't work.
That's right. So right now, at this point, this is fairly new. We announced that thing back in September last year, so fairly new. At this point, we support specific plugins like the barcode scanner, the face integration, and things like that. But we don't support your own custom plugins. The reason is that we need to make sure that your plugins are fine. We need to curate them somehow. So we are working on that. But right now, if your application uses custom plugins, you can't use this. Now, let me make it very clear that this is totally optional. You can use PhoneGap without using PhoneGap build. This is just a convenience. This is just an add-on. But if this doesn't work for you, by all means, build locally. And for a lot of people, local build is going to be the way to go, and that's totally fine. But we are working on solving that issue.
So just so I understand you, when you do the PhoneGap build process, it makes those separate packages, and then you can install them on your device?
Yes.
From a third-party install instead of from the App Store, you can install from the phone.
Basically, but I'll show that in a second, but basically the short answer is it creates all these files, the binary, so IPA, you can download them and then install on your device, or even better, you can read a QR code and it's going to from the device, and it's going to install it right away on the device. I'm going to demo that in a few minutes.
The question that has to do with tying it to a repository.
Right. Okay, so I'm going to demo all that because trying to describe how PhoneGap build works, it's actually a lot easier to do it in front of you, and I'm sure it's going to answer a lot of the questions. Okay?
Is PhoneGap build, is that free and open source?
All right. There is no catch because remember, this is new, optional, totally up to you. Oops. I'm getting confused by myself. You can always go back to this. So is this free and open source? It's not open source because it's a service. So this is not software. This is a service in the cloud. Okay. Is it free? It is free for an unlimited number of open source applications. Unlimited. So you can build as much as you want, as long as your project is open source. How do we know? That has always been a problem because a lot of people do that, give you free license if you build open source software, but a lot of people cheated. How do we know that is that still working? Almost. If your project is hosted on GitHub, it's open source, and we'll go get it and build it. Unlimited, free. You have you can build one private application for free, and you can build 25 private applications for $9.99 a month. 25 private. Got that, or should I go through that again? So free.
Is 7 of them considered one, or?
No. That's one. That's still one application. Yeah, absolutely. It's one application. You have 7 different executables, but that's one application. So you can build one private app for free forever. If you need more than that, then it's $9.99. It's a cloud service, so it's subscription based. $9.99 a month for up to 25 apps, which should cover your needs. And the last thing that I should mention, anybody here is familiar with the Creative Cloud, Adobe's Creative Cloud? $49.99 per month, you have access to all the Adobe tools, Photoshop, Illustrator, all the tools, all the video software, and of course PhoneGap Build as well. So if you are already a member of Creative Cloud, then you can build private for free.
So when you are building the app using this service, and when you are paying, can you use those commercially, or they still
Can you use what?
Can you use those applications commercially, or they still have?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So what's a private app mean?
A private app is an app that is not open source.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, so that you don't publish.
Let's see.
If we can find your code on GitHub, it's a private app. If we cannot find your code on GitHub, it's private. That's how we.
In other words, I could build a commercial application for whatever purpose I want, and it's still only whatever
It's-
month or.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Does the shell kind of protect the insides a little bit? Specifically, I'm looking at things like I sometimes use back notes, and I want to and I need a key token to do that. I'm very protective about that.
Sure.
That means I know it has to go out to the client's app.
Yep.
How do I protect it? Because that's going to be sitting in the middle of what's literally an HTML application.
Yeah. And the answer to that is the same way you would do it if the application was running in the browser. Remember, this is really a web app. It's running in a mini Chromeless browser. That's really how you have to look at it. A PhoneGap app is a web app running in a Chromeless browser, on your device. So if you use, single sign-on, SSL, SSH certificates, integrity, all these security frameworks, it's going to work, and it's going to work the exact same way because it's the exact same thing. It's a web app. And so if you connect back to a server using SSL, it's going to work the exact same way.
It's actually a weakness of the web app where you have to supply a key and a token to be able to access some back-end thing, because I have to put an intermediary service and keep the key.
Yeah, I mean, there are many different ways of doing it that, I think are fairly secure. But if you can do it in a web app, like all the banks and the home banking stuff, you can do it, in PhoneGap. Question there?
So we got 25 apps for $10 a month.
That's right. Private.
Now, you go from 1 to 25. Who's going to, I imagine most people aren't going to go from 1 to 25. They're going to go maybe 5 or 6 or 10. Couldn't they offer like 10 for $5 a month? It seems like quite a jump from one to the other. Paying for all these extra apps, you may never use them. It seems it's not a fair price.
Give them away.
The other option is to buy a MacBook for $2,000.
Yeah. I hear you. We feel that $10 a month, if you really have a number of apps, that's kind of a fair price, but I see your point that it's a big, there is a distance there between a single app and 25 apps. But at some point, we need to limit the number of options that we offer because, but I hear you. So again, that this is also why we do this. If we hear consistent feedback that you feel that $10, even though, PhoneGap is free and open source, everything is free and open source, if we hear consistently that, $10 a month for people building a smaller number of apps is too high, we'll certainly take that into account.
There's no charge if you have it natively, right?
There is no charge.
There's no charge if you have it natively on your machine.
If you have it natively on your machine.
If you instead of PhoneGap Build, you can still download PhoneGap, correct?
PhoneGap itself is free. Yeah, so and that's a good point. So let me make it very clear that if you use this build model, you can build 10 million apps entirely for free. If you use the local build approach, it's entirely free no matter how many private public apps you build, this model is free from start to finish. Commercial apps, no royalty, no nothing.
What's to keep somebody from offering build service in the cloud at a lower price than Adobe?
Nothing. But there is an infrastructure. So all this internally is running on EC2. So this is not free for us. There is a pretty significant infrastructure cost associated to that. But I mean, your point is well taken. If someone thinks they can do it for cheaper, that's competition.
I got one of your Adobe products, Dreamweaver.
Yep.
Last year I had on one PC, I had PhoneGap integrated with it. Moved it to another PC. Now I have PhoneGap Build. Is there any way to unput PhoneGap Build from it? You can go back to PhoneGap.
From Dreamweaver? Yes, absolutely. So you want to build locally?
Yes.
Yeah. You should be able to do that. And Holly, maybe you can learn how to PhoneGap build. I mean, I can find a way for you, but you should totally be able to.
Possible.
Yeah.
So, exploring that performance question a little bit, you mentioned that there are certain computationally intensive applications that are not suitable candidate for PhoneGap. But is that something that you would only discover after the fact?
No, in advance. All the applications, everything that's a business app, that's, you show me a page or a social network, or you show me a page, I select something, you transition to the next. That's 80% of the App Store. If you go to the App Store, 80% of the apps, that's what they do. They go from one page to another page, show you some data, you can capture some data, you can tweet and all that. All these apps are going to perform as well as a native app. Very, very good, because the performance of JavaScript is not going to be the bottleneck.
But there are some borderline cases, right?
Yes.
Maybe you're taking a little voice snippet and you're doing some compression on it. Now,
right. Remember, if that was the case, so that's a good question. If you find that, I got to 95% of what I wanted to do with PhoneGap, with HTML, but that little feature, it's too slow in JavaScript. Does that mean that you have to give up on all the goodness of HTML? Absolutely not. What you can do very efficiently in that case is delegate that super small piece of your app to a plugin. So it's going to run natively. Exactly. And then 95% of your app is still HTML and cross-platform. Don't give up everything because you need to do a super duper hard compression that's very intensive in terms of resources. Do a plugin, it runs natively, and you're good to go. All right, last question. I'll keep taking questions, but I need to show you some stuff because we still have so much to do. I asked, how long can I go? I want to go late.
Sorry, this is just a question about performance as well. So
yeah.
We've actually used PhoneGap, and we developed an app on iOS, and it's great.
Yeah.
It's maybe a little slower than native, but still, it's good. But on Android, as soon as we got to a certain number of views and some DOM, a certain level, it killed. It's like really slow.
Yeah.
Why is that? Why is it on Android that performance takes?
Well, so there are a couple of reasons. Their version of WebKit, depending on the version of Android you're on, maybe an older version of WebKit, slower. Does that mean that you can get performance right? On some really old versions of Android, that hopefully are kind of fading away now, maybe. But in most cases, you should be able to, to get decent, close to native performance. Now, I'm going to go, when I'm taking you through a couple of apps here, I'm going to go through a couple of very simple performance techniques that everybody should use to make sure that their applications run fast.
Why is it different though for iPhone versus Android? I mean, on similar specs, hardware-wise,
Right,
why
right.
is it
Well,
so different?
yeah. I mean, that would be a great question for Google. But yeah, essentially different versions of WebKit, you know, different levels of optimization.
I've heard iOS uses hardware acceleration for some of the animations.
Well, iOS enables hardware acceleration. So, and that's one of the tips, one of the techniques to really get, you know, performance to a great level. You should absolutely use hardware acceleration. It's going to make a big difference. All right, let me show you a bunch of things here. So I'm going to go back to a regular browser. And so what I wanted to do is first show you a couple of things in my browser. And I do that for a good reason, so I'm going to resize that to maybe the size of a phone, more or less. And show you a couple of applications. So here is a project that I've been working on. Anybody knows PolitiFact? I'm not going to do politics here, but they fact-check statements that politicians make, and they rate these statements. So I'm going to take something that I don't even, person that I don't even know here. So you have a list of statements that they checked, and then you select one, and you see, okay, the statement, the rating, and then there is social network integration. You can tweet, Facebook, email, all that great stuff. So this is a really simple app, but you see that it has, it behaves like a mobile app. And the reason I'm showing that to you here in my browser is because that is where I'm going to spend most of my time. And that is really good news, because especially Google Chrome has really good debugging capabilities. I can introspect the elements, I can debug my code, I have access to the console. This is fantastic. As I'm developing the app, I have access to all these great tools. So my message here is, when I develop a PhoneGap application, I spend 90% of my time not playing with my device, but in the browser, because I'm building a web app, and I can use all the great tools, the developer tools, that these browsers provide. So a PhoneGap app is a web app. Just remember that. You have it.
Is that a PhoneGap bridge simulator?
Is there a PhoneGap bridge simulator? Yes, it is actually called the Ripple emulator. It's a product that was built initially by RIM, I guess now BlackBerry. And actually, let's see, I may have it here. All right, here we go. It stays there. All right, maybe that's too big. Too small. I'm gonna move that here. Okay, here you go. Okay, so that is the PhoneGap emulator, if you want. And the nice thing about it is that you can simulate events. I can simulate, for instance, a device-ready event. I can fire different events. I can do a number of things here. So that simulator is actually available as a Google Chrome extension. So that's how I started it. Okay, that's actually a really nice way to look at this application and see how it's going to behave inside or on the device. And of course, you can choose here different devices here, so it's going to give you a feel for the size and stuff like that. Okay, so it's called the Ripple emulator. All right, so disable that for now. Okay, so I'm going to show you a bunch of things that are completely unrelated. Now, let's see. All right, this one is cool. So even though I said, if you're building the next wild 3D game, maybe PhoneGap is not the right option. But if you build a game that is not that sophisticated in terms of visual effects and stuff like that, you can totally build this in the browser. And so this is a game, or at least a prototype of a game, that, again, I built inside the browser. I'm running around. I don't know exactly what I do, but anyway, so that's the idea of a game. You can do it, it's fast, and you'll see it on my device. See how fast that guy runs? We'll see how fast he can run on my device. Okay, so that's just another type of application, one that we will build together in a second. This is employee directory application. As you can see, start from the beginning. Okay, all right, so I work for a pretty cool company here. Typical app, you can navigate through the different levels of your company and then call and stuff like that. Obviously, these features I'm not going to be able to test in the browser. Call, place a phone call, but still, you can test, again, most of your application inside the browser. And then maybe a last one here, more of a kind of an enterprise-looking app. So this application is using some census data. This is more like developer part, but you see, I choose a state, I choose a county, and then I have a bunch of stats here. That this app was built for a tablet form factor. I can do that kind of stuff.
Is that using Sensa Touch for the data?
If it's using Sensa Touch, is that what you
for the data that's being
no, it's for the charts, you mean? It's using, I think it's using high charts, yes. Yes.
For the game that you showed, what game engine did you use for building?
What game engine did we use to build that game? None. This is actually custom built, and it's using the technique to get really the performance. It's using CSS sprites to kind of move stuff around with hardware acceleration. That's really a very efficient way of doing it. Now, there may be some game engines that give you that, but we wanted to provide a very basic example so that people could see, without the clutter of using a game engine, a very simple example that people can relate. So this is kind of a bunch of different applications. Now, how were these applications built? They were built using all sorts of different frameworks, and I knew I had one more slide to actually show you, and that's actually an important one, so I will go back to it. Oops, there I was. Okay. I'm going to go back to this and go full screen. How were these applications built? They were all built in very, very, very different ways. And so this is a very important topic because people ask us all the time, which framework should I use? If you understand now that PhoneGap is not a framework, in the sense that it's not a UI framework, it's not an MPC framework, then your next logical question is, what framework should I use? And our answer is, whatever you want. At least that used to be our answer. Now I'm getting a little more direct, I'm getting a little more, trying to lead you a little more if you want. I'm not going to tell you which framework to use, but I want you to recognize that all these frameworks are not equal. And so I put that slide together to show at least two big approaches that you have. You can go full stack. You can choose a full stack framework. Full stack frameworks are usually very heavy, and heavy on mobile is not always good. Okay, they are big, large size, and what do? They try to solve all the problems. So why do I call them full stack? Because they will take care of DOM manipulation. They will take care of architecture, so they will provide some MVC type of structure to your application, and they will provide a UI layer, so they have pre-built components that look a certain way, and hopefully you can customize them a little bit. And so in that category, full stack, you have things like Sencha, jQuery Mobile, Dojo, and there are others. So it's important for you to understand these are one type of frameworks, full stack framework. And then in the other column, you have what I call, custom stack, build your own stack. You say, well, for that manipulation, I want to use jQuery. Or some people are saying, no, you shouldn't use jQuery for mobile applications because it's bloated with code that you really don't need. Who cares about IE6 compatibility if you know that you're building for mobile? Yet jQuery carries all that stuff. So there is another one, Zepto, which has a syntax. It's essentially a clone in terms of syntax, but it focuses only on modern browsers. And the good news is that when you're building for mobile, you can actually focus on mobile browsers. So I'm going to choose Zepto, for instance. And then for MVC, I'm going to choose Backbone, which is very popular, or Angular, which is also very popular, or Ember, for instance. So I'm creating my own stack. And at the top there, these are just UI toolkits. These guys are 95% CSS. They just provide, they don't try to be your MVC framework like these guys. They just try to help you with the look, because most of us are developers, so we are good at building ugly stuff, right? It's stuff that works, but design is not always in our genes. So these guys here really help you by providing you with some nice looking components out of the box. And you have things like Twitter Bootstrap, Zerp Foundation, Ratchet. These are all CSS frameworks that really work pretty well. So my preference as an individual, this is not a company statement, is that when I build for mobile, I tend to like the lightweight approach of a custom stack because it gives me the flexibility of choosing what I really want, and it keeps my application very, very lightweight. Okay, but at least when you choose a framework, understand the different categories. But the point is, all these applications that I showed you, they are all built using different approaches, and that is totally fine with us. So now I want to show you how to actually build your applications, how to develop it and then build it. Now, to develop it, this is one way to do it. I've been using WebStorm as an HTML JavaScript IDE. It's pretty good. I'm kind of doing a little bit using Xcode, which is an IDE that Adobe is working on. It's open source. It's still early release, so not totally ready for prime time yet, which is why I'm still doing a lot of work here. But take a look at Xcode. It's also free and open source. It's a new HTML IDE if you want. But the point is, use whatever you want. Okay, you do it if you have some people use Dreamweaver, that's totally fine. Okay, so this is essentially my app, and guess what? It's HTML with a bunch of JavaScript files and a bunch of CSS files. Okay, so really it's a web app. Okay, so how do I build it? Well, I can do local build, in which case I would have to use Xcode and things like that. Or I can build it using PhoneGap build, and I will quickly show you how you can do that. So this is PhoneGap build. So when you log on, you have access to your list of applications that you have built before, and you see that I have built a number of them. So what we're going to do here is build a new one. So I'm going to say, okay, I want to build a new application. Now you have two options here. You have a low-tech approach, which is to upload a zip file. You see that? So you zip up your app, okay, you go pick it up somewhere on your file system, and you upload it, and there you go. That is pretty low-tech because it means that every time you make a change to your app, you have to zip it up again and upload it. So let's go for high-tech, okay? And the high-tech approach is to link this to a repository. on GitHub, for instance. So I'm going to go open a different tab here, and this is my own GitHub account. That's how I looked when I was young. And this is employee directory. This is the application that I showed you before. And so this is the URL of my GitHub repository. I'm just going to do Command C here to copy that URL. Come back here in PhoneGap build and just paste it. Okay, so I paste the GitHub URL and it's fetching the code. So right now it's getting the app and it found it. Great. And so now it's going to say, okay, what do I do with that? And I say, okay, you go build it. Okay, and you see here that these moving lines means it's in the process of building. You can select it and you see that it's spinning. So in other words, it is building the app right now for 6 different platforms. Okay, so we'll give it a couple of seconds here. You see that 3 platforms are built: Windows, WebOS, Symbian. We're still waiting for 3. Usually it just takes about a minute to do it on 6 different platforms. Here is Android. So everything is queued. It's done asynchronously, so you know it comes in the order it builds. Question?
So if your app is built like a PHP, how are you using? Can you use PhoneGap, and how are you using PhoneGap build for that?
Yes. If your app is built in PHP, can you use PhoneGap? The answer is yes. As long as it's HTML at the end, right, you can do it. So here is a good architectural discussion to have. You know, the traditional way you have built HTML applications is using PHP or ASP or JSP. Essentially, the HTML is generated at the server side by some scripting language. That is something that, even though it works totally fine in PhoneGap, is not going to deliver the best performance in the world. And you understand why, is, you know, if I tap something on my screen to transition to slide to the next screen, but that next screen has to be built at the server side by PHP, I'm not going to have the smoothest transition that you can dream of. Simply not because PhoneGap is slow, not because JavaScript is slow, but because your network may be slow or your server may be busy, so I'm waiting for the network to come back with the page. So can you do it? Yes. Is it going to deliver a great user experience? No. For a reason, you know, users are a lot more sensitive to that kind of stuff in a mobile, you know, on a mobile device than they are in a browser. In a browser, they hit something and they expect it to spin for a little while, and boom, you get the new page. On a mobile device, people expect to do tap, 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 and you know, and they see the UI reacting immediately. So that could be the topic of a whole different session. But there is a new trend in the HTML world in terms of architecture that we call single-page application. And in a single-page application, you don't let the server build the UI, but you actually build the UI at the client side using JavaScript. So basically, you have a single page, one index.html. And what happens in a single-page application is that you inject, you know, view elements, HTML fragments in that page as needed, and then you remove them when the user asks for another page, and then you inject something else, and you create the views of your application dynamically at the client side using JavaScript. Does that make sense? So instead of your application being made of 50 different pages created at the server side by PHP, your application consists of a single page, an empty page initially, that you dynamically populate with DOM elements. You inject and remove DOM elements as the user navigates in and out of pages. that is the architecture that's going to give you the performance, because you never need to go to the server. If you need to go to the server for the UI, bad user experience.
You do need to go to the server to hit the database.
For the data. So can you still use PHP? Absolutely. In an ideal world, you would use PHP only to get your data. So what you do, you build the view, the next view in JavaScript at the client side, and then you make an XML HTTP request. If you are using jQuery, you do an AJAX call or a GET call to a PHP service that's going to give you a JSON document, using a RESTful service. And now the UI is already there, and boom, you get the data, and you merge the data into the UI. That's what's going to give you the best performance. The number one complaint about PhoneGap performance has nothing to do with PhoneGap. It's basically that you wait for the server to give you the view. And I mean, that's not rocket science, that if you wait for the server to give you a view, it's going to take the time it's going to take. Okay? All right, so that thing is built. Now, there is no magic here. Someone asked me about, developer certificate and that kind of stuff. So the iOS build right now is not usable because I didn't sign the application. With iOS on Apple, you always need to provide a developer certificate and an application provisioning profile. For all the other guys, you can actually install that thing. So you have two ways of doing it. So for instance, for Android, I can click that blue button, and you see that it's downloading the APK. Boom, it's done. And now I have the APK that I can install on my device. Or even better, with an Android device, I can scan that QR code, and it's going to install automatically. Of course, a lot of you have iPhones, so I'm going to fix the certificate problem. So you see that I have a list of keys that I already registered, but I wanted to show you the whole story. So if I go here, edit my account, you will see here that I can register my keys. And if I want to add a key, for people who are familiar with iOS development, they will understand what I'm doing here. I'm going to call this key Dallas. Okay, and I need to provide two things. I need to provide my developer certificate that I think I have on my desktop here. So that's a P12 file. So that's my developer certificate. I need to sign it with my developer key. And then for each app, I need to provide a provisioning profile. And let's use that one. Okay, and then it's going to create a known key, and I will be able to use that key to sign my app. So if I go back to my app here, and I go to employee directory, I have a specific key for employee directory. So I have that key, which is a combination of developer key and application provisioning profile. And now I have to rebuild this, of course, because it has to create a signed build. And while it's doing that, let me see. I'm still on.
Do you have to have a Macintosh computer to...
Absolutely not.
What was he talking about there?
Oh, to create the key, you asked. To create the developer key? That part I'm not told, because you know, Holly, you need a Mac to create the key?
Yeah, you have to use the keychain.
Okay, yeah. So for the, is there no other way to create a key? But maybe. It's likely that you need a Mac to create the key.
It's in the FAQ in PhoneGap that you do need a Mac for that one step.
For that one
you
step.
You could probably just go in the Apple Store and create it, and then be done.
Yeah. That's right. Exactly. That's a good idea. And send your email and check Facebook and all that stuff.
I will add, you can do it on Windows using VMs, but if you're caught by Apple trying to register keys or publish apps, your account's banned for life.
So you need at least one Mac, I guess, in your company. So this is my iPhone that I streamed here. I'll show the frame to make it more clear that this is my iPhone. Okay, I'm gonna put it here. So I'm gonna use a QR code reader, and I'm gonna actually scan that barcode, which is the hardest part of my presentation. Here we go. All right. And as you can see here, it tells you, build.phonegap.com wants to install the app. Absolutely. And so you can see that it's installing it here. So depending on your network, see, I don't have to download anything. Everything is happening over the air. And boom. And now I can use that application. And this is the application that I showed you before. So I can look for my friend Michael Scott, Queue Manager, and you get the idea. And navigate through the org chart. I can call him, but let's not do that. These are fake numbers, by the way. And that's it. So with that, I didn't install any SDK, I didn't install any IDE, and I had the app running on my phone here. Ready to go.
Just curious, what was the UI framework that you used for that?
Yeah, good question. This is using Ratchet CSS, so you can Google Ratchet CSS. It's fantastic. That's kind of the new iOS look that you see in many apps. It's a little bit like Twitter looking. I don't know if people would like that UI on Android, but I'll leave it up to you. But that's using Ratchet CSS.
And you're saying now what plugins does Build support? It support child browser?
Support child browser, barcode scanner, Facebook, and push notification. Push notification. And Holly, who is my colleague working on the same team, published a really cool tutorial on push notifications. So if you want to know about that, check Holly Shinsky's blog, devgirl.org.
What is that?
Devgirl.org. Dev, like development. Did I say?
So what APIs are not supported in HTML5 that you can do in the PhoneGap? Because what are the specific ones?
That exist in HTML5 that you can't use in PhoneGap?
No.
The other way around?
HTML5, you can't do it in HTML5 that you can do in PhoneGap.
Oh, well, I have a great application for that I built, and that's available on the App Store. So let me stream this thing again. So let me close that guy here. All right, and go full screen here. All right. So so if you guys are interested in learning about PhoneGap APIs, in the App Store, you can look for PhoneGap API Explorer. This is an application that I wrote a while ago, and that shows you all the APIs, and that was your question, right? That are available in PhoneGap, that are not available in HTML. And not only that, but how to use them. So for instance, if you want to get your current location, this is the one line of JavaScript that you need to write, regardless of the platform, and I can invoke that method from there, and it's going to give you here your acceleration, or if I want to watch the acceleration to build some kind of a game, you see that I can do that. So this application is really getting through all the APIs that you may want to, like for instance, contact API for find your contacts. This is going to go, so this is the one line of JavaScript that you have to write, and it's going to go on your device, and it's going to go find all your contacts on your device. So this is really a good app when you want to get started, like you have the database, for instance, getting a SQL statement executed and things like that. Or what I did before, the capture of a video. Okay, it looks complicated, but look, this is the one line of JavaScript that you need to invoke. If I invoke that one line of JavaScript, it's going to do the trick again. Here we go. And use.
Can't do that with HTML5?
No. You can play video, but you certainly cannot capture video. Until, you know, WebRTC becomes available on all these different devices, but today in current browsers you can't capture video.
You can actually use the user media to
Capture
video currently.
In mobile Safari?
No.
Yeah.
In HTML5.
Yeah.
It's actually been around for several years, but it always prompts you for authorization.
Yeah.
Like a plugin. So I did.
So that's the complete list essentially. Compass, I mean, things like that.
How do you debug if you use a device API? How do you debug? If it's in a browser, we can use a prompt to do it.
In recent versions of the different platforms, like for instance in iOS 6, now you can use the remote debugger, and then you would need Xcode to actually run the application on your device, but still step through your code. Or even better than that, I mean, not necessarily better, but another option would be to use the debugging capabilities of PhoneGap build. Okay, so let's take a look at that. So with PhoneGap build, we'll try that here. So look, if I go in the settings of the application, I can actually enable debugging. Okay, now it's gonna have to it's actually gonna have to rebuild the application to get a debug build of the application if you want. So that's gonna take a while. I mean, not a long time, just a minute. I'm going to get ready here to install the new version. This feature is still new, so, and we'll see here if we get it to work right away. So let's wait for the iOS build to complete.
What was your app called? PhoneGap API reference?
API Explorer.
API.
It's not gonna. You're not gonna find it on your iPhone because I built it at this point only for tablets.
Okay.
So you need to get it for a tablet. I'm gonna build a phone layout too, but I need a vacation. Okay, so this is gonna be that. So I'm reinstalling the application. Oh, I'm not streaming that, so let me go back here and stream my screen. Here we go. All right, so the application is installed. Okay. So I'm gonna run it there. Come on. Okay. And now I'm going to move that here to the right, and I'm going to hit debug. And I'm going to resize this a little bit. And yeah. This may actually not work. As I said, this feature is still under development mostly. But so this should enable you to actually walk through the DOM and kind of do remote inspection and things like that. But it's not working tonight. So this is something we're still working on. So in the meantime, I mean, and frankly, if you have Xcode, remote inspection is going to be better because this works over the network, so it's pretty high latency because every single message has to go over the network. If you do it with Xcode, you know, your device is connected through USB, so the debugging experience is a lot smoother than this. Yes.
Do you have a recommendation for how to? So I'm working with a company that just recently started using PhoneGap for our latest project, and I've mostly been on the Android side, so I don't know if I'm going to articulate this question properly. I know the guys working on the iOS side have been having some problem with, not really a problem, just a little bit of an annoyance with the way we set up our version, our source control, that we have like all of our HTML files and everything are in the assets directory of our Android project. And for the iOS project, I think they have to create like 2 different repos and then like have some symbolic link to the assets directory in the Android file. I don't know if you have any recommendation of a better way to do that.
Well, that's how I do it when I don't use PhoneGap build.
Yeah. Well.
So the key thing is, I'm going to do it on your side. You know, if you build for iOS, you know, the project has some kind of structure, and then you have the www folder, right? And then here you have all the iOS specific stuff. Now, if you build for Android, you need to create an Android project, and again, it has some level of structure, and then you have, you know, the www folder where your web app lives. So please, what I don't want you to do is to have these as 2 different directories, because if you do, now you have 2 different code bases, and you know, it doesn't work. So typically, I pick my main platform. So for instance, I'll say, okay, iOS is my main platform, just as a matter of file location, okay? So the files really live there, and then you create a symbolic link, but it seems that that's kind of what you're doing, to make this folder point to that one, so that at least everything is centralized in one folder. That's the best I can think of. I mean, the key thing is to make sure that you have one real folder and then symbolic links pointing to them. Okay. Just to avoid having duplicates, because that's when it becomes out of control. And the rest for building purpose, you know, you can use something like Grunt.js or some build tool to kind of move things around and really get the file structure that you need, or move things to a repository that you need. But that's kind of what I do. Question there?
Is it true that Apple initially rejected the app because they were built by PhoneGap initially? I mean, and is it still kind of a specific usage that we need to aware about?
No. I can't comment. I'm not aware of any app. I'm really not aware of any app that was ever rejected because it was PhoneGap. What I can tell you today, I mean, I'm aware of PhoneGap apps that were rejected. Like I'm aware of Objective-C apps that were rejected. Now, they were not rejected because they were PhoneGap apps. They were rejected for other reasons. And, you know, I mean, I have a number of apps on the App Store, and one of them was rejected once. And you know what happened? So you get an email and it says, very nice, you know, we rejected it and this is the reason. And you can comment. You can probably, no, I don't agree because blah, blah, blah. And that's what I did. And we still didn't come to an agreement. And then they said, a new email came in and said, well, it looks like we need to talk in person. Let's make an appointment for a phone conversation. I spoke with the guy for 20 minutes, explained exactly what, in fact, the application was the one that I showed you, the API Explorer. And the reason they rejected it is because there is a, you know, in the licensing agreement, they say you can't have demo apps. And they argued, they said that that was a demo app, which, you know, I can totally see their point. And I said, no, it's not a demo app, it's a documentation app. It's an API reference, it's full documentation. And we argued back and forth and settled it. And as you can see, the application is in the App Store. So applications are absolutely not rejected because they are PhoneGap apps. They may be rejected for, you know, for the same reason Objective-C applications are rejected, and then you deal with it. But I can really demystify that thing. It is simply not true that applications are rejected because they are PhoneGap apps.
That rumor came about maybe 4 years ago when Apple changed their licensing.
Now, as an Adobe,
everyone was scared, but I don't think anything ever got rejected.
As an Adobe employee, I can tell you that what was targeting, what, you know, they targeted at that point was not HTML apps. Okay. Yes.
You said that there's a push notification plugin. Which OS support that plugin?
iOS, Android, and that's it.
Is that the Ratchet plugin you talked about?
Is that right?
Is that the Ratchet plugin?
No, Ratchet is the UI toolkit. The question was about push notification.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's only for iOS and Android right now. But again, plugins are community efforts. So you know what you can do is, now I'll show that to you. I tried. Oh, look at that! All of a sudden that came up, but I'm not going to try. PhoneGap plugins.
And which version is local notification support native?
Okay, so we'll try to find out. Okay, so you go to GitHub, so you Google like I did PhoneGap plugins. So there is a GitHub repository where you will find all the PhoneGap plugins by platform. So I'm going to choose iOS, and you see that we have all kinds of things like barcode scanner. So local notification. Let's see, push notification. Okay. So here is push notification. Okay, this plugin is built for Cordova. Okay, greater than 2.1 credits. I don't know if there is a
That's
link.
not the one that.
Oh, that's not the one?
The one that's supported by PhoneGap build and the latest version
Oh, okay.
is that updated for both
Okay.
iOS and Android. That's the push plugin.
Okay. And where is that one? But that's only for PhoneGap.
Well, you can use it with build and outside of build.
Ah, okay.
But that's
Fine.
the better version of that.
Yeah. And where is
It's on
it?
my blog.
It's on your blog. So you really need to read Holly's blog is the bottom line. Because she has that good documentation. Yeah,
You said the cloud build was a recent
Yes.
development based on feedback. What kind of things are you working on?
plugins, and potentially other platforms. You know, so we work with people from the different vendors. I mentioned there are other platforms that are coming out like Firefox OS. This is not not at all a commitment that we're going to support Firefox OS in PhoneGap build anytime soon, but these are the two things that concern us that we are working on is better plugin support, including potentially your own custom plugins, and always looking for new platforms that become relevant and make sure that we integrate that. And better debugging.
You said that there were some performance techniques that you were going to...
Some performance techniques?
That you were going to previous to?
Yeah. Well, we talked about a few, and
the asynchronous...
Yeah, so, okay. I don't know how late you want to do this, guys. Are you still with me?
With you.
Okay, great. Let's see if I can quickly take you through a performance presentation that I did very recently that has a nice summary of enter full screen. All right. Very, very quickly. I know that's not the one. No, that's not the one. Okay, I may not have it here. I don't think I have it. Okay, so we spoke about number one, don't let the server build your UI. That seems like an obvious one, but you'd be surprised. And by the way, a lot of people, when they start using PhoneGap, they jump on jQuery Mobile because they say, hey, jQuery Mobile gives me all these UI components. And oftentimes we get in trouble because jQuery Mobile by default, it uses that model where the expectation is that the UI is generated at the server side. You can work around that, but just don't do that. Okay, don't let the server generate your UI. Number 2, anybody heard about the button or the click delay in general? So you click something on your UI, and for some reason, it takes 300 milliseconds to kick in. Now, people are going to say, Christophe, 300 milliseconds, who cares? People care a lot, because that's the difference between a snappy app, an app that feels responsive, and an app that feels laggy. Okay? And why is that? Because what the underlying OS is doing, it's making sure that you did double click or double tap the item. So it's waiting for 300 milliseconds. If after 300 milliseconds it didn't get a second tap, then it said, okay, that's a click event. Now, you know, purists, they jump on that and see, that's bad, that's not native. You know, this delay is not acceptable. I'm telling you. And casual users too, it doesn't feel native. That's what 300 milliseconds do to you. So the obvious technique is to say, okay, I'm not going to use the click event. I'm going to use a touch event, because HTML supports touch end, touch start, touch end, and instead of a click, I'm gonna use touch start. Boom, immediate response. You can do that, but then try to run the same app in the browser like I did before. It's not gonna work, because my Mac doesn't support touch events, so I'm going to try clicking on something, and that's not going to work. So now you need to build into your app the logic to say, if it supports touch event, use touch start, otherwise use click. Before you go reinvent that wheel, there are libraries out there, and the most popular one is called fastclick.js, that are going to handle all that automatically, and are going to get rid of that 300 millisecond delay. You won't believe it. It's going to make a huge difference in terms of perception of the responsiveness of your application. Question?
Do all platforms have that delay, or only certain ones?
My understanding is that it's iOS only.
And is it in their native Safari as well?
It's in their native Safari as well, absolutely. In fact, that FastClick library was built by the Financial Times, because they kind of, you know, they wanted to optimize their mobile site. Initially, it wasn't built at all for hybrid applications. Okay, so that's the second question there.
Can I ask a more general question, I think, towards Adobe itself? It looks like when you look at any of these web platforms, people seem to kind of like hacking them. Take 50 different things from 50 different places. If you're an enterprise developer, you're kind of looking for a kind of a consistent stack where your learning curve is like kind of predictable, get resources from the market. That's the reason why the ASP.NET and JSP kind of like right now, I don't think anybody like kind of has that kind of place in the HTML5 space. AWS, they get Flash and Flex. You guys are moving towards HTML5. Even so far, everything I heard other than PhoneGap, you need to piecemeal like 20 different things, and those things kind of keep changing, which is going to have a good life, which is not going to have a good life, right? Like, so you're going to create a life cycle like where if we're investing heavily in an enterprise app or something that's going to live for 4 or 5 years, that's not a good place to go. Like either you guys need to give more of a direction or get behind a stack, or like a kind of even if it is an open source one. The AngularJS comes from for example, Google. Knockout.js comes from the guy who works at Microsoft. Like, there's like a JS Views and JS Render. That's another Microsoft guy that's going to have the MVC framework. There's like, if you look at it, it's just like 50 different things for each one of these. Like CSS, whatever different thing is. There's not one IDE. There's not one stack like on the client side that you can look and say like, hey, I'm going to get behind it. And then like a jQuery mobile, the reason it got popular is because it's kind of like however heavy it is, it kind of gives you a consistency. Like you can kind of spend 2 weeks learning it and kind of produce something, right? Are you guys planning to do anything? I'm not trying to do a lecture here.
No.
I'm just like really, I look at the HTML5 stack, that's the most frustrating thing. I don't
think there's any direction in any web clients as far as
Adobe has a deep knowledge like on how these things work. Flash, right? Like if you guys have done RIA, it's like nothing but It's like
well, and
feedback
we also,
are-
I mean, to be honest with you, we also learned some lessons because, you know, you just spoke about the stability and the completeness that Flex offers.
Right.
Now I can take the, you know, the other side of the argument and say, yes, it gave you that stability until it lasted. And you know, and some people today are not happy at Adobe because they feel that you know, we don't support them anymore as they would like us to support them with Flex. So even though for a number of years it looked like that stable, reliable platform, I'm sure that today some customers may feel differently. So, and that's a lesson that we learned, is that, you know, we feel that today people are reluctant to embrace something that feels proprietary. And I'll give Sencha as an example, because I think Sencha is the closest thing to what you described. It's bigger, more complete than jQuery Mobile. In fact, it has all the benefits that you described for jQuery Mobile, but more, because it covers more stuff. It has charting and a lot of things. Now, I don't know how many people here have tried Sencha. When you build an application with Sencha, you may as well be developing an application in some completely proprietary thing that's kind of far away from the web. So now, as a kind of a project manager in the enterprise is my background, I need to choose, do I want my 500 developers, do I want them to learn web technologies, really become really good at JavaScript, HTML, and CSS? Or do I want them to learn something that's going to abstract all that in a way that's initially pretty nice, but that's going to introduce a huge dependency on that stack that is not the standard stack? So I can really take the two sides of the argument here. And short term, it's obviously very nice to abstract everything and have, but what happens if Sencha disappears in 2 years? Now I have that huge investment, and
that's where
I
Adobe
can't
can
find
come into
skills.
picture. That's where my point is. That's where Adobe can come into picture, right? Like if you're big enough a company, you guys understand.
Yeah, but again, I mean, are we going to build another big framework that has the same problems as I just mentioned for Sencha? And I think the position that we took right now, and I can be very clear so that there is no ambiguity there, we are not doing that. However, one thing that Adobe is really good at, and I think nobody would argue with that, is user experience, graphic design with all the tools like Photoshop, Illustrator, and things like that. So we are working on a thin UI layer in the same box as I had like Twitter Bootstrap, Xert Foundation, and things like that. We think we can help here. Just pure CSS to make your PhoneGap application look great on all the platforms. That is, not introducing a dependency. If you look at, some of these frameworks that are successful, yes, you mentioned Angular, but Angular, even though it has the Google logo now, it was really built by, one guy or a few guys. Backbone.js, very popular framework, one guy, one smart guy, super, compact framework. If that guy goes away tomorrow and decides to do something different, the dependency is not that great. It's all open source, compact, and things like that. So today, based on my experience as an enterprise guy in charge of a project, I would personally go for the no dependency, less dependency path, because I'm going to train my guys to the core web skills. And that's what I would feel comfortable with, because these skills I know are not going away. These skills are here to stay. 10 years from now, I bet the web is going to be there, HTML is going to be there, JavaScript is going to be there, CSS is going to be there. Is Sencha going to be there? Frankly, I don't know. And training all my guys, 500 developers on learning the ins and outs of Sencha, but in fact, kind of losing the core technologies underneath, I don't think I would feel comfortable with that. But I mean, I see your point, and I could argue either sides of the argument. But
I don't know if it's relevant or not. On the server side, package management, like Node package manager, like you get on the .NET side, seems to be kind of like giving that agility, like a sense of it kind of feels like lightweight. You can kind of swap out things.
Right.
I don't know if there's similar thing on the client side.
Right, and the point, I mean, your point is well taken that, you know, it's early now. Right. You know, like, for instance, what the description that I was making, to transition from a multi-page architecture where everything is done at the server side, right, in terms of UI generation, to a single-page architecture where the UI is generated, that is very new. Right. And I think, you know, clarity is going to come, you know, and we'll have more obvious options very soon, but right now it's new, so, you know, things are being positioned. I would make the bet for learning, and as an individual, you know, what do I want to learn for my career? Do I want to learn something that sounds proprietary, or do I want to learn standard skills, web standards? Personally, as an individual developer, I would bet on I want to learn web standards because I know that this is going to be a good investment for the future. So
it kind of takes more of the shape as best practice, and Adobe is driving web standards. They're pretty much taking over and driving web standards, especially in CSS3. And I mean, it's going to really take more of the shape of best practice and more sort of a framework.
So I gave you client-side generation. I gave you the delayed click. I gave you hardware acceleration. Very, very important. I wrote a blog post about that. So if you want, after you finish with Ali's blog, you can read mine too. What else? I mean, if you do that, test on device. Okay. A last one. I'm going to show you a last application because I really know it's getting late and maybe the projector is not even working anymore. Yes, it is. I'm going to show you one last thing. This is what I call common sense performance techniques, and I wanted to write my next blog post, I think, is going to be about that. Common sense. And let me show you what I mean by common sense. So I recently built an app that is essentially a Facebook integration sample app that I call social. Here we go. So it's not a great looking app, but the goal of the app was to show integration with Facebook, the Facebook APIs. Now, so what I'm doing behind the scenes is using the Facebook JavaScript SDK. That can be actually slow. When I ask for my list of friends, you know, Facebook may have other things to do before returning that list of friends to me, so it sometimes takes time. And I went through different iterations of that thing. And look what I have now. I'm going to do this, and this is what I have. So I want you to see that again. So I press the button, and of course right now it's pretty fast all around, but let's try to find something that's, okay, here I think we really saw it. So what I'm doing first is transition. So I'm doing the transition right away to the new UI, okay? I send a request to Facebook at that time, but if I get the request, because you know I set that transition, that sliding thing to, I think, 300 milliseconds. I say, you know, take that page transition, do it in 300 milliseconds. But if Facebook is in a good day and my connection is good, I'm going to get the result within 300 milliseconds. Please don't start merging your data as you are doing the transition, because that's going to give you a very choppy experience, because now you are it's called a reflow of the HTML as you are transitioning. So it has to recalculate every time you add a field. I mean, there are not a lot of fields here, but imagine a UI with a lot of fields. Every time you kind of touch you know, a div and add something, the browser, the web view has to do a full reflow of the page. If you are doing that as you are transitioning, it's gonna go like that. It's gonna be jerky. So what I did here is I run the transition right away and I wait till the end of the transition to merge the data. So the transition is always boom. Now you imagine, as I said before, if that page was coming from the server, you imagine the disaster in terms of user experience. So that would be terrible. In the middle you have, I build a UI at the client side, but if I get the data, I merge the data, even if I'm in the middle of transition, that's not good. Or what I've seen also, and I'm guilty of that, I've done it before, especially with my own data, because when I build the application, I have my local database on the server. So guess what I do, because that's the obvious lazy way of doing it, is I'm waiting for the data to slide the page. You see what I mean? So I'm making a call to my database for data, and only when I will get the data, I'll say, oh, I get the data, I can build a view, and now I'm ready to transition. And that's a total disaster, because if you tap and now you go in production, your server is far away, and your internet connection is terrible, you tap, nothing happens for 2 seconds. And now your app gets the data, creates the view, and slides. For like 2 seconds, the user was like, what's happening here? Nothing. And I can tell you a lot of applications that actually work like that. That's common sense performance, right? Always give immediate feedback to the user. If the user taps to go to a view, display that view even if you don't have the data, because the user can understand that the data is not there, but the user can't understand when nothing is happening. So if you display the new view and then you spin a little bit, the user understands exactly what's happening. The view is there, but the data is not there yet. If you don't do anything, your application is not responsive, looks dead, terrible.
Are you able to wait for the transition with the CSS transition?
Absolutely. Yes, there is an event in CSS that you can listen to get notified. I think it's end transition or something like that. If you look at one of my last posts on hardware acceleration, you will see that I use that.
I'm still interested in how you test all the API. Is that, for example, if the debugging is not functioning very well, is the fact that most of your API is JavaScript, you can actually just leverage your Chrome.
Oh yes. The only thing that you can test in Chrome is like, the device APIs, because obviously that's not available in Chrome. Like accessing your contacts, if something goes wrong there, you really kind of need to debug that on the device.
Because like the Chrome, like an Android emulator, you can actually emulate some of them.
Yes.
But PhoneGap,
no, because it's more of a simulator, right, and not an emulator in the sense that it's not a real emulation of the OS. It's a simulator in the sense it's going to give you the form factor. You're going to be able to trigger a few events, but it's not a real OS emulation like the Android. There are pros and cons there. That's also a little bit the difference between iOS and the Android emulator is great in the sense that it's the real OS, but it's really slow when you run it on your machine.
So I would say maybe that is a little bit challenging if you use PhoneGap and you want to test the device API.
As I said, the fastest way to do it is to use like a recent version of iOS and a remote debugger. And that's a very efficient way to do it. It's through USB, boom, boom, boom. You can step through your code. It works really well.
What's the best way to develop apps for platforms and devices that you don't own? Like, is there a nice emulator that you recommend where I could look at how it would pretty much render in an Android or a Windows phone, even though I don't have all those devices?
Well, every SDK has an emulator.
So I would just run it in there.
Yeah, so the Android SDK, the iOS SDK, the Windows Phone SDK, the BlackBerry, they all come with their own emulator.
So if you're building it for whatever devices, you want to at least get the emulator.
Yes, that's a good.
If you want a Windows phone device, just go to one of the Windows phones hackathon. They're very keen to give away phones.
Yes. Absolutely. I have a few in my bag. They keep sending them to me.
Oh yeah, they really want us to
to show at the yeah, the PhoneGap. Yes.
What does PhoneGap support? If my enterprise is building an app, it's mission critical. We find an issue, we can't fix it.
Yeah.
What does that do?
The answer to that is here. So you go to phonegap.com/support. And you have all the support options. All the way to, I mean, I don't know what your company is, but like for real enterprise customers, it's the enterprise, 24/7, unlimited. And that's negotiated. All the other options, you have a price tag. This one is really negotiated depending on the typical enterprise support, depending on the size, the number of developers, number of apps. We'll be happy to make a deal. Any other questions? Come on, guys, it's only 9 o'clock. Is it? No. Yes. Wow, that's a good guess.
How does PhoneGap compare to other cross-platform frameworks such as Titanium?
Yeah.
How does it compare?
Well, good question. How does it compare to other cross-platform systems? So, number one, we don't have a runtime. So that's good, because it's going to be faster. Number two, we don't do cross-compilation, which I think is good. Because if you do cross-compilation, you really have a hard time keeping up with all the platforms you support. So cross-compilation would be, platforms, and you named a few there that you write your app in JavaScript, but it's in fact going to cross-compile that into native. Okay. So that sounds like a great idea, but obviously you lose granularity every time you cross-compile. But what concerns me the most is that these platforms change a lot. And for you to keep up with a cross-compiler, I mean, I've been on that side of the technology, with Flash and Flex, and I can tell you it's hard, because this field is moving super fast, and iOS is coming with all these new features. Now, every time you have to tweak your cross-compiler, adapt your cross-compiler to translate JavaScript or whatever your language is it's really hard. Here, it's really light. We run kind of natively in the sense that HTML and JavaScript is a native features of all these platforms. So there is no cross-compilation. The likelihood that the thing is going to be broken next time they release a new version of iOS is very slim, because the core of what you do is building a web app. And as I mentioned before, I think that's really a good investment to do, to make. Today, in this very uncertain world, I think one thing is stable is, basic web skills. That's a good place to make an investment, and that's where we are. Then you have a few direct, competitors that do exactly the same thing. So that have a kind of a wrapper. And then I would say, to me, there is even no competition there, because PhoneGap is really the de facto standard for hybrid applications. And the thing that makes the difference is, as I mentioned before, that we have all these vendors actually working with us to make that bridge work really well. And that's the difference. Our bridge is really produced by us, but also by these vendors, and I think that's a really good thing.
This is all front end and client side. Is there anything in the works on the back end, such as pulling data from the database to feed the app, through JSON?
Right. I mean, that's a good question. There are some vendors doing, adding these server-side layers.
But not Adobe's.
Not Adobe. And I mean, oftentimes customers have these I mean, basically, it's RESTful services. You know, it's the way it works these days. So do we need to come up with something to put in the middle of what you already have, your existing RESTful? You know, I think that, and because usually when you speak about server stuff, you're rarely talking free, and I mean that's the discussion that I had this morning with our, you know, it's like, won't inject you in the middle of my server if you don't add real value and if you want to charge us for it. And I think that's a good point. If you have RESTful services, that's really all these applications need. So even though, you know, they may be third-party vendors who find a niche and something nice to do, like for instance, if you didn't have existing RESTful services, they may automate that. We don't think it's a horizontal business that, you know, customers are really in need for. So the answer to that at this point is no.
So piggybacking on the same question, should you use open technologies like Java as a middleware instead of going to these MBAS vendors? Is that what you're saying, who are providing kind of toolkit which does it?
Yeah, I mean, I think every customer is different, which is also why we don't want to kind of impose one way of doing it. Right. Because if we said, hey, you need to go through our middleware, people would say, well, in my case, it's not working because of this and that, you know, security, double firewall. I mean, every customer is different. So to answer your question is, you know, we don't really get involved. In some cases, you know, a vendor may offer something that's of value in your case, and you should absolutely consider that. But we don't feel we can make a general statement saying, you know, the market is in need of that piece and we absolutely need to bring it to the market. We don't see that now.
You didn't cover, well, I asked this before, local storage on the device.
Yes.
How is that managed? Do you have like an API to do
Absolutely. So there are two options essentially. You can use the local database that's available on these devices.
That's part of HTML5.
As part of HTML5, it's a little tricky. Yeah, as part of HTML5, it is true, except that again, even though it's in the spec, a lot of browsers don't implement it natively yet. So we will work as a polyfill. If your browser implements it already, we'll go with that. If your browser doesn't, your web view doesn't, we'll polyfill it. So we'll, you know, we provide an API. Most of the current browsers, especially iOS, it's still using WebSQL as opposed to IndexedDB. So, but anyway, so that's just a different API. The bottom line is we offer an API to get to your database. The second option is local storage, which is basically a key value pair data store. So depending on your needs, that may be the right option.
I'm thinking like loading information from, let's say, with some of the products you have the ability to find an SD card and to be able to go to the SD card and stuff, as opposed to being forced to use the onboard system.
Right. So that there is also a file system API. So you can, you know, if your SD card, I mean, your SD card should be viewed as part of the file system. There is a file system API, so you can read and write to files on your file system.
Popular apps using PhoneGap right now. Apart from your demo apps, who's actually using?
Thousands of you know, applications out there. Well, PhoneGap.com/apps. We have a gallery there of 47 pages of you know, 20 applications on each page. But that's a good place to go. Like in terms of popular names, Salesforce.com, SAP, BBC, Wikipedia. These are all popular names. But you can go to PhoneGap.com apps and you'll see the names there. Zingap for games actually surprises people. But yeah.
Question for you. Does PhoneGap have any plans to support native TV applications for Roku or platforms like that that are on a lot of media centers these days?
Yeah, I mean, these are things that we are always considering. In fact, if you look at if you go to the Cordova website, so that's cordova.apache.org, you will see some of the things that we are experimenting with, including even a desktop version of PhoneGap that would kind of wrap a web app and make it an app on your desktop as opposed to accessing that web app through a browser. I mean, things like that. But yes, all these platforms, as soon as they have a web browser, they are potential candidates, and they expose a browser component like the equivalent of a web view, they are potential candidates.
Some of the TVs are doing that now.
Yeah.
Has anyone experimented with or tried using PhoneGap to create an application for the Raspberry Pi?
That's a good question. I'm not aware of that.
Because that's supposedly running a full-blown Android.
Yes. Now, again, one of the great things about PhoneGap and Cordova is that everybody in this room can actually contribute. If you have an idea, we totally welcome that. And you can look at the list of contributors and you will see that there are people from all different backgrounds doing all different types of things because they think it would be cool. So if someone in the community starts on that idea, why not?
So my question is regarding the licensing restrictions or guidelines what we need to follow in developing a web application. Like maybe there is a programmer who has put his work in an MIT license, and I'm using his application in my commercial application development. So tomorrow I get to know that he has copied his code, or if there is some problem with that code, what are the risks?
Well, why would that code from that developer end up in your application?
It's a front-end plugin or
okay, yeah.
just like that.
For plugins, you really need to check each plugin individually. For PhoneGap itself, because obviously, if we don't try the plugin, it's up to the developer to choose a license. For PhoneGap itself, it's Apache. The whole license is described on the Apache website, and there is no. It's the same Apache license that other Apache projects are using. So this is a well-known, accepted, no-issue type of license in the enterprise. For plugins, it's a different story. You need to check each individual plugin to choose the license that they to see the license that they chose.
So there are risks associated with using the plugins?
Well, if you install a plugin and someone, even though I don't think I've seen that, but why not? If someone wants to make money out of a plugin, I don't think we restrict that. So if someone uses a commercial license, develop a plugin and wants to make money out of that plugin and has some kind of a commercial license or an open source license with some restrictions that you have to contribute your code back to the community or whatever, that is something that you need to check at the individual plugin level. It's very possible. I'm not aware of the fact that we tell plugin developers that they have to use a specific license. Are you aware of that, Holly? I don't think we do. So it's really up to them to choose the license that they want, and it's your responsibility to check what is the license that they use to see if it fits your own requirements.
You have to be careful to guard against third-party scripts that you don't know what they're doing as well. There could be security issues there.
That's right. Absolutely. So that's like any piece of software, So that's why we are trying to curate that by having these approved plugins that are supported in PhoneGap build. So these are plugins that we essentially validate for that kind of thread. If someone writes a plugin and puts it on a website somewhere, overseas, we can't guarantee that it's safe, right?
So in general, there is a risk on an end user perspective. That's what I'm trying to understand. Like, if there is a plugin which is kind of malicious or something like that, which I'm using in my application, there is a risk associated with the end user. What are the worst thing that can happen in a commercial?
Well, I mean, the operating system is always a sandbox too, and hopefully, you know, like, they are going to catch that, you know, it's going to ask for permissions, and if all of a sudden your app is asking for file system access, if clearly your application has no business in reading my file system, hopefully a user is not going to grant that permission. But I would say if you're serious about using a plugin, you should, you know, usually these plugins are small. And so you should, these plugins, I mean, all the plugins I know are open source. You should review the code for your own, you know, safety. Yeah. All right, guys. I think it's getting pretty late now. I'm going to take a last question. It's a good one.
When you built your app in the cloud, we went and scanned the QR code to do the download. I'm assuming that had nothing to do with the App Store. That was just a binary download.
Binary download, local install, development license in terms of Apple. Then you can rebuild with a store certificate. So, you know, when you build for iOS, you have the developer certificate and then the store certificate. Yeah, now you have built your application, you're ready to go to the App Store. You need a special certificate. You rebuild with that certificate, and that's the IPA that you can submit.
Well, I guess
to the App Store.
my question was, so if you didn't want to go through the store, is that a way to distribute your app, or if you wanted to distribute it at an enterprise level?
According to Apple licenses, no.
Okay.
Now, you know, you can, if you're an enterprise, you can have your private app store and things like that, but these are developer IPAs. In fact, the provisioning profiles expire after a number of days. I mean, it's a, you know, it gives you a lot. It's a year or something like that, or yeah. But they expire, so it's not meant for, hey, now I can, you know, deploy that. In fact, it's limited. You can only provision a certain number of devices. So
how would you do that to do an enterprise deployment?
Enterprise deployment, Apple has a special program for that.
Okay.
And that can go all the way to having your private app store inside your enterprise.
Okay. Thanks.
All right. Well, thanks for coming and staying so late.